In this video, we're getting into the 9 things that you must know before moving to Vancouver. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to separate fact from fiction, what is exaggerated and what is simply false. There are so many stereotypes in Vancouver, including it's an incredibly expensive city, it rains all the time, and it is a crime-ridden city. All of these things are based on fact, but are they the reality? That's what we're going to get into in today's video. Watch this video all the way to the end to make sure that you're making the right decision when you're moving to Vancouver. Let's get into it right now. One of the most important things I think about moving to Vancouver is to have an understanding that the city of Vancouver is just one small part of the entire region. And at its very root, this is necessary to kind of understand how the city works and where it makes sense to move. Too many people get focused and caught up and living in the city of Vancouver when the city of Vancouver is only 115 square kilometers. Metro Vancouver, on the other hand, is nearly 3,000 square kilometers. So there are a lot of areas that you're missing out if you're too focused on the city of Vancouver. There are roughly 700,000 people that live in the city of Vancouver these days. And in the entire region, in the Metro Vancouver area, we have nearly 3 million residents. And so you're missing out on areas like Richmond and Burnaby and Coquitlam. These are all very viable places to live. And if you're comparing those areas, these are not outlying outer suburbs where you're having to commute many hours. Because of the way that we have structured our city, these are essentially contiguous areas that would usually be part of the city. If you were living in Toronto or in Calgary or in Montreal, these areas that we call suburbs are actually legitimate bedroom communities of the city of Vancouver, and honestly, cities in their own right that you should be really thinking about living in if you're moving to Vancouver. Don't get too caught up in Vancouver and make sure that you understand that the city of Vancouver is just a part, but a significant part of the entire Metro Vancouver region. Okay, so let's talk about weather and very specifically rain. Most people hear about Vancouver, they think that it's an incredibly wet place, and that's not entirely incorrect. But it's important to understand that the rain that we do get, and the city of Vancouver gets approximately 1,460 millimeters of precipitation every single year. That is at the higher end of large municipalities in Canada. So to give you an idea, I think it's Toronto that has 831 average millimeters of precipitation every single year. And then the city of Montreal has 1,041, significantly less than the city of Vancouver. But what we do get isn't really spread out through the year. It's very much contained in the winter months. So mostly from mid-November into March is sort of the period that you're going to see the most precipitation. And it can be really, really heavy. In fact, November and December are periods where we usually get more than typical in winter period. And so if you really want to avoid rain, well, try and avoid being in Vancouver during those periods. Of course, along with the rain, the clouds comes darkness. We do live in the northern hemisphere, so we are impacted by the amount of time in the day as the winter solstice approaches. So those are all things to consider. But the other nuance that most people are actually really not aware of is how different the amount of precipitation is from one part of Metro Vancouver to another. Now, it's not an enormous area, but there is vast differences. From North Vancouver at its peak, there you get an average annual precipitation of over 2,500 millimeters a year. And Deep Cove specifically is a community in North Vancouver that sees more rain than anywhere else in North Vancouver. So if you're looking to avoid rainfall, avoid living in North Vancouver. But 2 other municipalities you want to have on your list and be aware of that are both around the 2,000 millimeters of precipitation annually are Port Moody and Coquitlam. These 3 municipalities are all, not coincidentally, right up against the North Shore Mountains. And as I've talked about in other videos, we get weather that comes off of the Pacific Ocean. So the clouds get blown in and they basically come over all the land until they hit the North Shore Mountains. And in order to go over those mountains, they have to unload what is heavy in them, and that is precipitation, which falls on North Vancouver, Port Moody, and Coquitlam, unfortunately for you if you live there. But if you don't live in those areas, well, it can be a very different experience. And so the areas that are furthest from that, and specifically to the south, are the areas where we actually get the least amount of rain. Tsawwassen is the city that sees the least amount of rain, and there it's just 900 millimeters of rain every single year. That's not a lot more than the city of Victoria, which is considered one of the drier cities in our region, and it's not a lot more than Toronto either. The other municipality you want to target if you're looking for an area that gets less rain is White Rock or South Surrey, and in that area they get just slightly over 1100 millimeters of rain every year. And these two areas, Tsawwassen in particular, are dry a lot of the time. You can pretty much guarantee if there is a rainstorm in North Vancouver, it's going to be sunny in Tsawwassen, which is why the nickname of Tsawwassen is Sunny Tsawwassen. There is a video I think you're really going to want to check out all about the weather and living in Vancouver, and I'm going to link it right there if you want more in-depth information about what it's like to live here along with the weather. That's a video I think you're going to find very helpful. If you're looking for more help than just videos, you're thinking of moving to Vancouver and you're thinking of buying a home, well, I am a real estate agent that has helped hundreds of people move to Vancouver and find the right home. I can help you as well. My contact information is right there on the screen. Reach out anytime and let's get that conversation started. In the meantime, let's get back to the video. So another thing that's really important for you to understand is that if you are moving here, you may not be able to buy a home, and specifically if you're not Canadian. We do currently have a foreign buyer ban in place. Nobody that is not a Canadian resident or a permanent resident can purchase a home. There are some caveats to that, some exceptions, and specifically if you're moving here and you have a work visa, well, in the fall of 2024, you are going to be exempt from this ban and you are going to be able to purchase as long as you're buying your primary residence. There's also an exception for students, but unfortunately the limitation on students is that they can only purchase a maximum property, a price of $500,000. And because of that, there's not too many properties in Metro Vancouver you can capable of purchasing. So that exemption isn't one that really comes into play in Vancouver. Now, beyond the foreign buyer ban, if you are allowed to purchase, there is a foreign buyer tax in British Columbia specific to the higher density areas. And so anywhere in Metro Vancouver, if you are not a Canadian, not a permanent resident and not a Canadian citizen, you will be on the hook for a 20% additional tax. And obviously that's incredibly significant. Now there is one big loophole when it comes to this tax, and that is if you're in the BC Provincial Nominee Program. I highly recommend if you're looking to move here, if you've been recruited in any way and you are not yet a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, try and get into that program if your priority is to own real estate in Vancouver. That'll be able to make it happen much, much sooner than it would otherwise. These are things I think you're going to really want to understand if you are immigrating to Canada and deciding to move to Vancouver. I did make a video just for you. I'm going to link that right there. Be sure to check that out. But let's move on to point number 4. Now, if you're moving here and you're not looking to buy, you're thinking of renting, there's also something that you need to understand. Unfortunately, there's nobody who professionally helps tenants in Vancouver. In many other markets, Toronto would be one of them. All residential realtors can help you find a rental property. They can put you together with a landlord that has a vacancy. Unfortunately, in Vancouver, that doesn't happen. There is no what we call MLS reciprocity. There's essentially no commission offered for somebody to do that work. And because they're not going to get paid, nobody's doing it as a business. That makes it pretty tough for you if you're moving here from somewhere else, right? There's nobody to help you along the path. And on top of that, because in today's modern era, there are so many scams around, people are really worried when their landlord's renting out a space about getting scammed. And so they're not going to be willing to rent to you unless you are here, boots on the ground, right in front of them, and they can see you face to face. And that makes moving here with some degree of uncertainty or the timeline being uncertain really, really hard. You really do have to be here in order to rent a place. And unfortunately, you're the one who has to do that hard work of sourcing your property. There are tools that you can use. The best ones, you do want to use Kijiji, you want to use Craigslist, and you want to use Facebook Marketplace. Those are the 3 websites I'd say that are going to be most commonly used. But 90% of the time, it's going to be an individual homeowner that is renting out a property, whether it's an investor who owns a condo downtown or a family that rents out their basement suite. 9 times out of 10, it is not a property manager. We do have property managers, but if they are involved, they're usually involved with corporations that own an entire building and they're renting out that entire building. It's not going to be a mom and pop deal where it's just one individual who's renting that out. No, they're going to hire a professional to do that work. But you have to remember that they don't represent you in that transaction. They represent the landlord, and they're not going to look after your best interests. So that is something you really, really want to be aware of. And if you do want a little help in understanding how our rental system works, I did make a video, believe it or not, just for you. And you can find that video right there. I'm going to link that one there for you before we move on to our next point. All right, I think it's important to understand when you're moving to Vancouver that the city is expensive. but it's not everything that is incredibly expensive. There are two very specific things that are going to be more expensive than anywhere else, and one in particular is really what drives the discussion about the cost of living in Vancouver, and that is the cost of real estate. Whether you're owning or renting, the cost of real estate is really significant, and it's higher than just about anywhere else that you're going to be looking, particularly in Canada. Just as an example, for a one-bedroom condo in a relatively new building that is somewhere around 600 square feet, you're looking at spending in September of 2024 roughly $700,000. That same condo will cost you roughly, I don't know, $2,700, $2,800, maybe $3,000 a month in rent. And so both those numbers are pretty astronomical. But if you remember, I also said that there are differences in this region. The city of Vancouver doesn't speak for the entire region. So if you're looking to save money, you may decide you don't need to live in the city of Vancouver, in the downtown core, which is the most expensive part of one of the most expensive cities in the world. If you were to move further out, let's say into Coquitlam or into Surrey, both in terms of rent and ownership, you're going to find that you can save significant amounts of money. You're going anywhere from 20% of a discount to 40% and up to even 50%. A house in Mission is about 50% of the cost of a house in the city of Vancouver. So it's a very significant divide if you're willing to move out a little further and spend a little more time in your vehicle or in commuting. And if you don't need to commute, perhaps your job isn't in the downtown core. Well, you might find that you can live in the city of Langley and commute to your work in the city of Surrey. And that can make sense for a lot of people. The second thing that you want to keep in mind is that gasoline is quite expensive in Vancouver, more expensive than it is anywhere else in Canada, east to west. To the north, I think that's another story, but most of us, that doesn't really impact, and we don't really talk about that. But in terms of where most Canadians live, Vancouver is the most expensive major city when it comes to gasoline. And on average, it's about 30% higher. I talked about it just in a video that I did recently, that there's two reasons for it. One is because of constraints on our supply, really depending on just a couple local production facilities. But the other is that we have Metro Vancouver taxes that fund our transit system, both public transit as well as the road network of the region. And then there's also some things that are actually cheaper. And what are those things? I mean, I don't want to pretend that the cost of real estate in Vancouver outweighs the things that are less expensive in Vancouver, but there are some things that I think people really should be aware that are cheaper when you live in Vancouver. And frankly, some of these are British Columbia as a whole, but specifically utilities. Electricity, natural gas, and water tend to be cheaper in Vancouver than you're going to find in other parts of the world, and certainly in other parts of Canada. So electricity specifically, British Columbia has a lot of hydroelectric power. It's incredibly clean, it's incredibly cheap. And so as a result, our electricity costs are, I believe it's a second or third cheapest in all of Canada. And I think it's even in North America. Quebec has the cheapest, but not far behind is British Columbia with incredibly cheap electricity. And to the tune of it's 1/4 to 1/5 of what Europeans pay in the UK or in Germany, where power, and in Ontario, frankly, I mean, it's not that much cheaper, but these are areas they can't rely as much on hydroelectric power, and they're using nuclear power and they're using coal generators. And that's a much dirtier, much more expensive way of producing electricity. Natural gas is kind of similar. We are a natural gas producer, and as a result, we have really efficient and easy access to relatively inexpensive natural gas. It's not really a huge expense. So for the most part, people that own homes in Vancouver, don't worry too much about what the utility costs are. You don't tend to get $1,000 electrical bills in the middle of summer because your electricity is so expensive and you're running air conditioners through the summer months. And conversely, in the winter months, you're not freezing cold. So we live in a pretty temperate climate, but you're also just not spending the actual cost of the utilities that are keeping you warm aren't incredibly expensive. And then there's water, which not only is relatively cheap, up until this point, most homes in Vancouver are not metered. So you just pay on your property tax bill annual amount. I think in the city of Vancouver, a single family detached house like I live in pays just $837 a year for water. And it's incredibly clean and great tasting. I think it's something that we're so incredibly lucky to have in Vancouver. Vancouver. But it is important to know that we're moving away from that single cost and unmetered, unregulated water access. And we are moving towards, with newer construction, they are metering water. And my understanding in homes that are having metered water, that it can run somewhere in the $200 to $400 a year range. It really does depend on how many people live in the house and how much water you end up using. But honestly, at this point, it seems to be a savings over the unmetered option. But these are both, in all respects, utilities in Metro Vancouver are relatively inexpensive. Another thing that is relatively inexpensive, and it's important to understand, is property taxes. We don't pay crazy, unsupported, we don't pay astronomical property taxes, as I have heard some regions, like Houston, Texas, as an example. Typically, areas that have really high property taxes are areas that do not have provincial or state sales tax, or income tax, I should say. And so they need to get money to the local municipalities in order to provide the services that are offered, and that is done through property taxes. In Canada and British Columbia specifically, we do have federal income tax, we also have a provincial income tax and a sales tax, and there is money that gets divvied up from the province, from the money that the province is taking in, and gets offloaded onto the local municipalities. So the local municipalities are not as dependent on the revenue from property taxes as they are in some other areas, which goes a long way in explaining why we have lower property taxes than most places. You are looking somewhere in the, say for $1 million property, you might be looking at around $2,000 annually, maybe it's $2,500 annually, but in that sort of ballpark. It's not an astronomical amount. The other thing to note is certain ethnic foods in Vancouver are incredibly cheap. And the one that always gets brought up as an example is sushi specifically, because in so many other parts of North America and Canada specifically, sushi is a real luxury. In Vancouver, the amazing thing is that there's a sushi restaurant around every corner. It's a very common thing to have in every community all over the place. And because we have relatively inexpensive access to the ocean, the seafood is relatively cheap, and there's just so many of these restaurants, they're competing so heavily, and the quality is phenomenal. So you have tons of really good, high quality sushi that's not very expensive, or at least not nearly as expensive as it is just about anywhere else in the world. Those are three things that you're really going to be saving money on. You're going to be saving money on your utilities, on your property taxes, and on sushi. So it's not all high costs in Vancouver. As I said, it's much more nuanced than that. You are going to be able to save money in certain respects. So let's talk about crime. There is a reputation that Vancouver has that it's a high crime city. And yes, we do have a higher rate of crime than the average in Canada. But keep in mind that we are the third largest municipality. We are the warmest large municipality. I mean, Victoria is a warmer climate than Vancouver, but in terms of its size, it is the most temperate of all of the cities in Canada. And so we do have an issue around homelessness, around drug addiction and mental illness. And these things are all interrelated. The result is that there is a lot of petty crime. There is also some violent crime that is really highly correlated to either drugs or mental illness. And so there could be a gang shooting that happens on occasion. There could be somebody totally unhinged that attacks a random stranger on occasion. But on the whole, what we have is a region that has a higher percentage of petty crime than most areas in Canada, but a lower percentage of violent crime. And I think that's something that not a lot of people really understand, and they don't understand the nuances of it or the reasons for it. For the most part, for me personally, going anywhere in Metro Vancouver, I feel really safe. I don't feel like there's any area that I'm going to be, whether it's 1 a.m. or 12 noon, where I need to be afraid for my own physical safety. There's certainly areas where I'm going to be a little more in tune with what's going on. I'm not going to be in my own head. I'm going to be my head's going to be on the swivel a little bit. But even in the most quote unquote dangerous areas of Metro Vancouver, for the most part, you're just going to be asked for spare change, or somebody's going to offer you either drugs or sex. And assuming that's not your thing, well, you have nothing to worry about. And for the most part, in these areas, even the higher crime areas, or the areas that most people think are quite dangerous, the people who live there basically leave everybody on their own. They're not interested in you, so you don't have to be worried about yourself too much. But there are areas that I would say, if you're worried about crime, you definitely want to be aware of and you may want to avoid. And these areas are where the homeless epidemic is at its peak. And in the city of Vancouver, that would be specifically the downtown east side and the areas that are immediately surrounding that area. I did a video a little while ago about Hastings Sunrise, and I talked about a slightly higher crime rate that would be present in Hastings Sunrise, not because of any issue necessarily within that community, but because of its proximity to the downtown east side. And so the people that live there that are destitute, that are desperate, they're hooked on drugs, they're homeless, they're looking for any way they possibly can to get their next fix. And so they turn to crime, and they're turning to petty property crime. They're going to break into a car if they see something in the car. They're going to steal a bike. They're going to grab something out of a backyard if it's available. And you do need to be aware of that if you're close to those areas. And it would be the same in some of the outlying suburbs as well. As these outlying suburbs become more urban, and let's say like in Burnaby, an area like Metrotown, or in Surrey, an area like Surrey City Centre, in Newton and Whalley, these are areas that you're typically going to find a higher crime rate because of its relation to homelessness, drug addiction, and mental illness. So it's definitely something that you want to be aware of. But at the same time, there is areas, and I would say they outweigh the areas that you need to sort of be on the lookout in, where it's really not a factor at all. There are vast swaths of Metro Vancouver where crime is incredibly low. And if there is a crime, it's really just the odd crime of opportunity, or somebody from one of these problematic areas is out and looking for opportunities. And so I can tell you, in a neighborhood that I live in, which is the Riley Park neighborhood of the city of Vancouver, 30 blocks from the downtown east side. Well, I guess it's more like 40 blocks, 35 blocks. And where I am, there's almost no evidence that that reality exists in the city of Vancouver. And there is almost no crime in this area. I mean, sure, it does happen occasionally. In the 13 years that I've lived in this neighborhood, I have had my car broken into twice, and that was because I left my car door unlocked. And so we had for a while somebody in the neighborhood who was walking by and just trying door handles, and if somebody was stupid enough to leave their door unlocked, well, you won the stupid prize by getting all your stuff stolen. And I won that prize a couple times, unfortunately, and I've definitely learned my lesson not to leave my door unlocked as a result. But for the most part, I'm talking about areas where you need to be aware. I can't really name areas where you don't need to be aware because the list would be too long. It is essentially almost everywhere else in the Metro Vancouver area that is not highly dense, that is not highly related to the issues of homelessness and drug addiction and mental illness. And there are so many incredibly safe neighborhoods where your children can play on the street, where your elderly mom can go out and buy groceries on her own in the evening, and you're not going to have to worry. If you do want a little more information about crime in Vancouver, I did make a video yet again about this topic. Be sure to check that out. I'll link it up above for you as well. All right, so another thing you need to be aware of is that having a car in Vancouver isn't actually necessary. This is one of the few cities in North America, I would say, where you don't have to live with a car. You don't have to have that expense. This is not a very car-centric city, and we've been moving more and more away from it over the course of the last 2-3 decades. And so part of the reason is that Vancouver is incredibly dense. It is the densest city in Canada at roughly 6,000 residents per square kilometer. And we have also a pretty good transit infrastructure. We have some of the highest transit ridership in all of North America. I know when I talk about this, people point out other cities where they do it better. I mean, yes, there is New York City as an example. Arguably Montreal or Toronto might have better or equal transit systems. And then of course there's the rest of the world, Asia, and also Europe. Both of those areas, I would point out, a lot of the infrastructure was able to be rebuilt in a much closer time frame, and a lot more money was spent on rebuilding that infrastructure in a much more recent time frame than we have here in Vancouver. We also have an unusual number of water crossings. So we need lots of bridges and lots of tunnels, and those things actually make getting around by car more challenging than it does in many other cities where they just don't have that. But The main point here is that if you live in Vancouver, and specifically here I'm talking about the city of Vancouver, I don't think you really need a car. You might need it for work or you might need it for kids. But honestly, like if you're a single person or a young couple living in the city of Vancouver and sort of in the higher density areas, and definitely in the downtown core, there's really no need for a vehicle at all. These days, you have SkyTrain, you have the C-Bus, you have the bus. But on top of that, you have bike shares, you have scooter shares, you have Uber now. You also have car shares like Moto and Evo as an example. So you have so many options. Plus, the city is so small. So much of it is actually really walkable, and you're able to walk from one side of downtown. The area of the downtown core is only 3.7 kilometers, and it's really easy to walk from one side of it to the other. You might not want to, but it's definitely going to save you time and also money versus jumping in your car, because you're going to get stuck in traffic and then you're going to pay a ridiculous amount of money for parking. It's really not worth it. And even for me, I live on the outskirts, and like many from the outside would view where I live sort of as the city center in Riley Park in Vancouver. And I have a car because of what I do. I need to be driving in different areas where transit is less convenient, but I also have 4 little children and I'm packing those along with me a lot, or all the time basically. So for me, getting rid of vehicles isn't really possible or a solution I'm at yet, but we do make a lot of use of alternative modes of transit or transport, whether it's riding our bikes with our kids to school, or it's getting on the SkyTrain when we might go to, I don't know, a BC Lions game. We're going to the Grey Cup in, I don't know, I think it's next month. I'm really excited about that. It's the first time I'm going to ever see the Grey Cup. But my point being, there are alternatives, and if you live in the city, it makes sense to use them. It also makes sense to rethink whether you really need a vehicle or not. And now I want to talk a little bit about diversity. And it's, again, this point of Vancouver as part of the region. It's important to understand that the diversity of our region is very different depending on where you're looking at living. So in the city of Vancouver specifically, I would say the city of Vancouver leads as an urban area in the diversity department in Metro Vancouver. In the city of Vancouver, we have roughly, as per the 2021 census, 42% of the population are immigrants. They weren't born here. So that's a massive part of the population in Vancouver. And I think I brought this up over and over again, but at my age, if I am 49, and if I go to a party, I am one of the few, if not often the only person that was actually born and raised in the city of Vancouver. Most people that live here were not born and raised here. And over 50% do not speak English as a first language. That just changed for the first time in 2021. So not only are most people moving here from somewhere else, there's a window behind this camera, and my tenant's cat just popped up right just a moment ago, and I nearly screamed. You're welcome. I didn't scream, or I'm sorry. Maybe it would have been fun if I did. But my point, going back to immigration and not speaking English. So we have a really significant immigrant population and an immense amount of diversity. In fact, I'm one of those people whose first language is not English. My first language is German. I grew up speaking German. Before I started the school system here at age 5, I was at home alone with my parents and my older sister, and all I spoke was German. And it was a hard transition for me personally when I started going to school, and I struggled in kindergarten and grade 1 with learning English, and then on top of that, learning French. But I digress. In terms of the city of Vancouver, there is one area that is considered the most diverse, and that is the West End. And I've mentioned this in a number of my videos as well, but the West End tends to be that place that so many people that move here from somewhere else tend to focus their search. That's where they start. It's like absolutely the most Vancouver neighborhood that you could possibly find. It's the stereotypical Vancouver neighborhood. You get the mountains there, you have the ocean there, you have the diversity, Stanley Park is right there, and then at your doorstep is also downtown. Plus, the cost of living there isn't incredibly high. I always think the West End is one of the better values considering its location in terms of the cost of either renting or owning. It's really incredible value. And this was also a place in my own experience. My parents when they moved to Canada, first moved to the West End in the 1960s, a very long time ago. But the West End has this history of being this melting pot and this incredibly open and welcoming community, more so as open and welcoming as so much of Metro Vancouver is. The West End really leads in that regard. The other thing I think when it comes to diversity to understand is there is a difference between what it's like to live in Vancouver and who lives there versus who is living in other municipalities. There are, to a greater extent, what I find is other suburbs of Vancouver are not as diverse. They may not be as white or European, but they don't have a diversity of other backgrounds as much as the city of Vancouver might have. And so I could point to very specific suburbs and say, in this community, Richmond being one. And incidentally, Richmond is technically, I think, on a diversity scale, either the most or one of the most diverse cities in the entire country. It has 80% of its population identifies as an ethnic minority. So an enormous, massive amount of the population in Richmond is self-identifies as an ethnic minority. The majority of those, and Richmond would be one of these areas that I'd say are more ethnically focused, are Chinese, both sort of the earlier wave of Hong Kong immigration and the later waves of mainland Chinese immigration. A lot of those people have moved to Richmond. Surrey, many people would say, has a higher percentage of East Indian population. North Vancouver might be more Persian, Iranian. Coquitlam, more Korean. It's interesting, I find, when you're looking at this, my understanding, for one, it's the same as any group that is moving from a specific country. We move where other people like us are, where it's sort of that transition is going to be a little easier. Maybe it's your community that has moved there or your family that has moved there, and you all want to live together. And as a result, once there's these ethnic communities, then the businesses start popping up, the restaurants and the grocery stores that cater to these communities and businesses that speak the language of these communities. So it makes a lot of sense. But it's not just on the neighborhood scale, it's also on the citywide scale where this is true. But another thing you want to be aware of is as you look at outer suburbs, these outer suburbs tend to be much less diverse. And so you see that population of people who self-identify as an ethnic minority will decrease as you get into outer suburbs like Mission or Chilliwack or Squamish. So a diversity in Metro Vancouver on the whole, but a diversity of how diverse each area is definitely the reality of what it's like in living in Metro Vancouver. I have a pop quiz for you. Do you know the difference between West Vancouver and Vancouver West? Do you also know where the West End is, or the West Side, or New West? Unfortunately, for some reason, we loved naming important regions of Metro Vancouver using the word West, and they can be very, very confusing. So when you're moving here, it's really important that you understand the differences, because if you're communicating these improperly, you're really going to confuse people, and you might be looking in the entirely wrong region. I get this all the time, and to be honest, it's not just from people that are moving here from somewhere else, but even locals get this wrong. Now, the city of West Vancouver, that is a separate city from Vancouver. It is a suburb to the north and west. It's across English Bay from the city of Vancouver. It is where some of the priciest real estate is, where some of the highest income is in Metro Vancouver. So that is West Vancouver. But then there's also Vancouver West. And when you're looking at a map and looking at the city of Vancouver specifically, Vancouver West is the western half of the city of Vancouver. It's not a neighborhood. The city is made up of smaller areas, but it is essentially, we have the white collar and blue collar region of the city, or the haves and the have-nots is the way that it, I think, kind of inelegantly and improperly used to be put. That division was much more stark years ago. The division between those two regions, that would be the west side of Vancouver or Vancouver West from the east side of Vancouver. That is along Ontario, which is 2 blocks west of Main Street. Main Street is essentially the core dividing line between the west side of the city and the east side of the city. And we use the term west side sort of locally. That's what most people in Vancouver, real Vancouverites, would call that western half of the city. We would call it the west side, but the real estate board calls it Vancouver West, which is really confusing because we also have West Vancouver. And then we also have the neighborhood, which is yet a smaller form area, the West End. And that is a neighborhood on the downtown peninsula within the city of Vancouver, within Vancouver West or the West Side, where, as I said, it's an incredibly diverse neighborhood. It's an area that a lot of newcomers to Vancouver move. And I get people who want to move to the West End calling it the West Side or calling it West Vancouver sometimes. And so it's really important that you remember, or try, and I will help you remember if it comes to it. But it is important when you're communicating to people about where you'd like to live and what areas you're focusing on, that you understand understand that there is a difference between West Vancouver, Vancouver West, or the West Side, and the West End. And then on top of it all, there is also New West. And New West is a suburb of Vancouver that's further to the east. It was the original capital of British Columbia. It has an old historic downtown. It's a beautiful little spot. It is also one of the better values in Metro Vancouver for its proximity to the city of Vancouver. However, its name is rather confusing. And so it's that west portion of its name is just a short form of Westminster. So its full name is New Westminster, and that is a separate municipality, New West is. And again, important not to get confused with the other areas that we use the word west for. So now that I've thoroughly confused you, if you need some help, if you are thinking of moving to Vancouver and you're looking to buy a home, be sure to reach out to me anytime. I have helped hundreds of families and individuals just like you move to Vancouver, not only find the right spot and shed the confusion around the right kind of west, whether it's West Vancouver or Vancouver West, but also finding the right home. And that can be a really complicated process when it's an area that you don't fully understand yet. And that's something that I am well versed in. I've been doing this for a very long time, almost 20 years. I can help you and your family as well. And be sure to reach out anytime. If you're not quite there yet, if you want to do some more investigation, well, I also have you covered. I have produced dozens and dozens of videos. In fact, I'm getting close to 100 videos now, all about living in and moving to Vancouver. So these are videos I really think you're going to want to check out and fully engage with, and have to give you a full understanding of what it's like to live in Vancouver, and not just where you should live, but also more importantly, I think, where you should not live. What areas do you want to avoid? There's very specific videos I'd love to meet you on. This video over here is all about the best suburbs to live in Metro Vancouver. And then this video over here is all about the downsides of living in Vancouver, so you can make sure you're moving here with your eyes wide open. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on next week's video.